Hey everyone! Today we're diving into the interesting world of Celtic warfare. The Celts were this massive group of people spread across different regions, each with their own unique cultures and traditions. But despite those differences, one thing united them: the way they approached war. Warfare wasn't just something they did, it was deeply woven into their everyday life, from their art to their religion and even how they saw the world. The Celts had a fierce warrior reputation. Sure, they might not have been as organized as the armies of the Mediterranean, but they were highly skilled metal workers, crafting incredible weapons and armor out of iron, bronze, and gold. They were innovators, especially when it came to working with metal, and many of their techniques were ahead of their time. Now, when it comes to Celtic society, things get a bit tricky. We don't have a ton of reliable records, mainly because most of what we know comes from biased sources or archaeological finds. But from what we do know, Celtic society had a lot of variety. Some regions had kings, others were run by tribal coalitions, and there were even places with more democratic systems. But regardless of the structure, there was always this heavy emphasis on warrior status and prestige. Social hierarchy was a big deal too. You had the nobles, the free people, and yes, even slaves. A key part of this hierarchy was something called clientship. Basically, the aristocrats or the higher-ups had followers who were bound to them in loyalty. The patrons or leaders would provide their clients with things like protection, support, and rewards in exchange for their loyalty and service. And when it came time for battle, the followers were expected to fight for their patrons. The higher your status, the more clients you had, and sometimes even the chieftains or kings were clients to someone more powerful. War and raiding were seen as opportunities to rise through the ranks. It wasn't just about power, it was about gaining wealth too. Cattle and treasure were the main forms of wealth, so many raids were aimed at stealing those. Other times it was about expanding territories or subjugating neighboring groups to boost a leader's prestige. It was a tough world, and politics could get violent. If a group was defeated, they often had to pay tribute or offer hostages to their conquerors. Now, let's talk about how all of this ties into funerary rites, because Celtic burials reveal a lot about their warrior culture. From as far back as the 12th century BCE, we find graves filled with items that reflected the status and importance of the deceased, particularly when it came to war. Elite individuals were buried with weapons, horse gear, and sometimes even vehicles like carts and wagons. These burials weren't just about what the person owned though. Sometimes, the objects placed in the grave were symbolic, maybe tied to religious or ceremonial beliefs. The Celts placed a huge emphasis on horse ownership, especially among warriors. This tradition continued through the Hallstatt culture, which thrived between the 12th and 6th centuries BCE, and later the Latine culture. In these periods, the rich and powerful were often buried with treasures like swords, drinking vessels, and even chariots. And as Celtic culture spread across Europe, so did these burial customs, though some practices, like burying elites with vehicles, remained more common in areas like Germany and Bohemia. One of the most interesting depictions of Celtic warrior hierarchy is found on the Gundestrup cauldron from Denmark. It shows warriors in various stages of life, perhaps even advancing in status in the afterlife. The scene includes foot soldiers, a war god, and a cauldron of rebirth. It's a powerful image of how deeply connected warfare, religion, and social status were in Celtic culture. And now let's talk about how horses and chariots played a major role in Celtic warfare. The Celts were absolutely renowned for their horsemanship, and owning a horse was a huge symbol of status and wealth in their culture. This wasn't just about riding for fun, it was serious business in battle. Horses weren't just a means of transport, they were a core part of how Celtic warriors fought. There's even this fascinating tactic called the tremarchia, described by Pausanias, an ancient Greek historian. Here's how it worked. Each Celtic warrior on horseback had 2 grooms, each with an extra horse. If the warrior's horse got hurt in battle, one groom would ride in to help, and if the warrior himself was wounded, another groom would step in to either take him back to camp or continue the fight. That's some intense battle strategy right there. Chariots were another major weapon in the Celtic arsenal, and Roman sources confirm that the Celts used them to great effect in battle. Two-wheeled chariots, pulled by a pair of horses, would often be driven straight into the enemy, creating chaos before the warriors leapt off and fought on foot. Caesar himself noted how the Britons, for example, would race around in these chariots, throwing spears and breaking enemy lines just by the fear and noise they created. But the real drama came when they leapt down from the chariots and charged into battle on foot. It was a sight to behold, a mix of skill and intimidation that left their enemies rattled. Interestingly, while Roman authors like Lucan and others claimed that the Celts rode in chariots equipped with scythes, we don't have solid evidence of that. However, Celtic mythology, like in the famous Irish epic The Cattle Raid of Cooley, does describe these intense bladed chariots, suggesting that the idea of weaponized chariots was alive in Celtic culture, at least in their stories. By the time we hit the 1st century BCE, chariots were starting to become less common in mainland Europe, but in more isolated areas like Britain and Ireland, they stuck around. During Julius Caesar's invasion of Britain in 54 BCE, the locals were still using chariots, and the Caledonians from what is now Scotland were even said to use them in battle at Mons Graupius in 83 CE. The sound and sheer presence of these chariots must have been something else. Even Caesar and Tacitus made a point of talking about the noise and uproar they created. Now, moving on to the evolution of Celtic arms and armor, the Celts were serious about their weapons. Their warriors were typically armed with swords, spears, and large oval shields that protected most of the body. These shields weren't just functional, they were often beautifully decorated with bronze or iron bosses. Some, like the famous Battersea shield, were more like works of art than just a piece of battle gear. Swords were another key part of their arsenal. They were worn on the hip or side, and the Celts used a wide variety of spears, from lightweight javelins thrown from horseback to longer spears used in direct combat. When it came to armor, the Celts were resourceful. Some of them wore armor made of fabric or leather, similar to the linothorax used by the Greeks. But by the 4th century BCE, the Celts were also rocking chainmail, which was actually a Celtic innovation. Chainmail shirts were made from thousands of interlocking iron rings, offering a balance between protection and mobility. It's believed that the Romans, when they encountered chainmail, quickly adopted it for their own use. The Celts also had helmets, but these were rare. Most of the ones we found are ceremonial, made of expensive materials like gold or coral, clearly intended for display rather than battle. However, as time went on, helmets became less fancy and more practical. Interestingly, the only region where Celtic helmets are commonly found is Italy, which probably reflects the close interaction between Celtic and Roman cultures. As for how the Greeks and Romans saw the Celts, well, it was a mixed bag. They definitely had a healthy respect for their fighting abilities, but they also looked down on them, often depicting them as wild, undisciplined, and even barbaric. The Celts' reputation for bravery, though, was well known. Roman authors claimed that some Celts fought without armor, or even naked, relying on their sheer ferocity and courage. These Greco-Roman stereotypes about the Celts, like the idea of them being savages who fought naked or practiced human sacrifice, persisted for centuries. But as archaeological evidence has shown, many of these accounts were exaggerated or outright false. The reality is far more complex, with the Celts contributing to the development of military techniques and innovations, like chainmail, that would go on to influence other cultures, including the mighty Romans themselves.